So good morning, everyone. I don't know if this is this on? Okay. So Reverend Zabriskie asked that I get started because he told me that there's a little bit of a time constraint. I'm going to talk this morning pretty much words that I delivered to my congregation. Thank you so much. That I delivered to my congregation a number of months ago, and I entitled it "Fighting Modern Day Dualism." And I'd like to read it to you and then hopefully have a discussion, and we'll see where the discussion takes us. Just so I remember clearly, it's what time does this have to be over? Okay, we'll see. We'll see how far it takes us, right? Okay, all right. First of all, I have to tell you, when I give a sermon at my congregation, when it's over, I get crickets. Absolutely nothing. And this place, I come and I just feel so warm and welcome. And it's just, you are just a warm and a vibrant community. And truly, it is an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to you, knowing fully well that I'm speaking to you from a different tradition. And it speaks volumes about who you are and what you represent in an age when we are building so many walls. We are together tearing them down. So God bless you. And let me just say from the beginning, thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. It is more of an honor. It is more of an honor and a pleasure for me than you might suppose. This morning I want to talk to you, as I said, about modern day dualism. And I think that if you look at history of religion, the greatest challenge to Christianity and Judaism, as I mentioned in the sermon this morning, was paganism. But later on, after paganism was vanquished in the book of Genesis and Deuteronomy, a new challenge arose, and that was Gnosticism. Gnosticism taught a variant form of dualism. Recent archaeology at Nag Hammadi, Egypt, and Qumran, Israel, have uncovered numerous Gnostic texts. First, in Egypt, they uncovered 52 early Christian texts, many of them like the Gospel of Truth, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Secret Book of James, the Apocalypse of Paul, the Apocalypse of Peter. In Qumran, which was the home of the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found over 900 texts, most of which were dualistic or Gnostic in nature. These 2,000-year-old scrolls teach us that the Bible had it completely upside down when it comes to speaking about God. In the Nag Hammadi texts in Egypt, the creator of the physical universe was not God, but a secondary power, a fallen angel, if you will, who had gotten out of hand. This demigod made the material world that we know, with all of its disease, death, violence, and pain. The true God, the true spiritual God, had nothing to do with the physical universe that we are seeing. And that true God is beyond time, change, death, and decay. The Nag Hammadi sectarians saw the Hebrew Bible and the Gospels as a lie. For example, the true hero in the Nag Hammadi text in the Garden of Eden story, was the serpent, because it was the serpent who opened Adam and Eve's eyes to the truth. The Gospel of Thomas offers a startling revelation that the only one of the disciples who truly understood Jesus was Judas, who was seen in the canonical Gospels as the traitor. Likewise, in Qumran, in Israel, 981 different texts. They are the oldest extant examples of biblical texts that we know of. Every book of the Bible is there, with the exception of the book of Esther. But we learn from the Qumran text that they believed in a teacher of truth. Some people translate it as the teacher of righteousness, who had it as his role to confront the forces of darkness, the forces of evil. They saw themselves as the forces of light. Everybody else was the forces of darkness. And the teacher of truth would lead them in a religious conflict, in an end-of-day revolt that would ultimately culminate in the Messianic age. The conflict, as they understood it, between Gog and Magog. Any of you ever heard of these fellows before, Gog and Magog? Well, the Essenes believed that there would be a cataclysmic battle before there would ultimately be a reign of peace. Judaism and Christianity rejected dualism. The church fought it during its early days, and some people would say that even the Crusades, to some degree, had something to say about this Gnostic or dualistic understanding. Judaism also does that. When we say the Shema, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one." It is a statement of the unity of God and a rejection of dualism. We have a prayer that we say in the evening. It's called the Ma'ariv Aravim, and it says God rolls away light from darkness and darkness from light, and both light and darkness, good and evil, are part of God's divine decree and God's plan. So Judaism and Christianity rejected dualism and Gnosticism. Having said that, not all dualistic understandings are bad. Plato, if you remember. I remember when I was in college, I read The Republic. Raise your hand if you read The Republic, right? Remember, Plato differentiated the world between the body and the spirit, the physical and the material, and he even used this image of a cave, that we're all living in darkness and we're living in the shadows and we need to leave the cave and enter a world of light. That was, to a certain degree, dualistic. Spirit is eternal, matter is finite. The soul lives forever, the body dies and is temporal. That's a sort of a healthy dualistic understanding. Even within Christianity, there are references to a dualistic nature, right? There's God, and then there's the devil, or Satan, depending upon how you want to interpret him. In some strains, Satan really is a powerful guy, and in other guys, I think he's a little bit more symbolic. In Judaism, we have the same understanding. We have what's called the Yetzer Hara and the Yetzer HaTov. Within every human being, there are powerful impulses, the impulse to do evil and the impulse to do good. That's dualism to a certain degree, right? I've got my little angel and I've got my little devil. We all saw Animal House. You remember the scene? And so it's all part of human nature. So you may be asking me, so like, who cares? Okay, this was an ancient battle that the ancient Christians and the Jews had to deal with. Who cares about dualism? I've been thinking a lot, and I read a wonderful book by Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who argues that the greatest challenge we are facing today is a resurgence of dualism. We see it on the political platform, where candidates speak about their opponents as the devil, evil, treachery. We see political candidates singling out media organizations and saying, "You're liars, you're untruthful." We live in a world where there are people politically and socially and religiously who are dividing the world between good and evil. You see it in the streets of Philadelphia. The police are seen either as oppressors and blacks are seen as criminals. You see it all over the place. Good, evil, light, darkness. Think about it. What's coming out of Washington now has a very, in my opinion, dualistic flavor, right? It's simple, it's catchy, it's dangerous. College campuses are places where it is becoming more and more difficult to express your opinion, because if you happen to say something that is not the current politically correct idea, you are shouted down. They don't want to hear it. Right? They're even talking about creating safe places where you can go and express your opinion without fear of criticism. That is absolutely horrendous. Universities should be places where all opinions can be heard. ISIS, Hezbollah, Boko Haram, Hamas, fill in the blank. They are dividing the world in between the redeemed and those who should be killed. Right? That is dualism. Hamas is teaching people to kill Jews, not fighting Israel, but kill Jews. Christians in Egypt are having to leave. You know this. Are you following this? ISIS is coming in and killing Christians. Why? Not because they're a political threat, not because they're a military threat, but because they are of the devil, the forces of darkness. And so if you either leave or you're going to be killed. Even the police in Egypt are telling Christians, leave. We cannot protect you. That is a terrible state of affairs. Christians, Jews, minorities, if you're a Shiite versus a Sunni versus, they're all at each other's throats. In the military world, in the political world, compromise is a virtue. You give and you take, right? If you are a dualist, you don't compromise. You don't negotiate. You either win or you die. Because compromise with the devil is seen as a vice, not a virtue. And that is why we are living in a dualistic age that is incredibly dangerous. You don't negotiate, you destroy. Our world, and I want to look at my notes here as I wrote down, is being divided between the unimpeachably good and the irredeemably bad. You're either on one side or you're the other. You're either the saved, the redeemed, or the child of Satan, the devil's disciple. Now, I did a fellowship a number of years ago on Freudian analysis. I will tell you, I will share with you, when I was in rabbinical school, I had great medical insurance, and I went through 5 years of psychoanalysis. Best thing I ever did in my life, right? It was fabulous. What did Freud teach? Freud taught about projection, right? And what did he say? If you have unpleasant thoughts about yourself that you cannot tolerate, that make you uncomfortable, what's the best thing to do to deal with it? You project it on somebody else, and they become the traits of the other person, and then you go and destroy that person. And then you never have to look within and see it within. How many of you remember the story? It wasn't a story, it was the tragedy of the massacre at that gay nightclub in Orlando, right? Do you all remember it? And then it comes out that this fellow, this deranged guy, a Muslim, was dealing with his own latent homosexuality, right? Makes perfect sense. He's struggling within, doesn't want to deal with it, so he'll externalize it and then destroy it. You project it. What becomes intolerable in yourself becomes the personification of the other. Nazis did that to the Jews. You remember? The Aryans were pure, chaste, giving, nationalistic, blonde, blue-eye, altruistic. The Jew was debased, lecherous, greedy, disloyal. And then when you do that, it's so easy to put them in the ovens. Jonathan Sacks, in his book, Not in God's Name, writes, pathological dualism, which we are facing today, does 3 things. First, it makes you dehumanize and demonize your enemy. They're unhuman. They're not real. They don't have the same rights as you and me. Second, it leads you to see yourself as the victim. Well, this is what they are doing to us. This is what Muslims are doing to Americans. This is what Mexicans are doing to our jobs. Fill in the blank, right? And then when you see yourself as the victim, you're able to take step number 3, said Sacks, and that is to create altruistic evil. I want to deconstruct that phrase for just a second. Did you ever hear that? There's evil, but in the religious mind, in the dualistic mind, it's called altruistic evil. It is killing in the name of the God of life. It is committing acts of cruelty in the name of the God of compassion because you're serving a higher good. You're serving the good God, and you're destroying the followers of the debased evil God of darkness. And it doesn't matter what religion you're in. If you're on the out group, that's where you belong. Think about it. When you see all the conflicts, religious, all around the world, it is all dualistic by nature. There's a wonderful book written in 1972 called Violence and the Sacred, written by René Girard. And he said that scapegoating, which is a product of dualism, externalizing and demonizing your enemy, is a perfect way to end conflict. And I want you to think about this. He said when 2 groups are fighting each other, and there's no way to end the conflict, The only way to end the conflict is to scapegoat and to choose a third party that is neither, to use Shakespearean language, a Capulet or a Montague, the one who stands outside of the feud and whose death will not lead to another cycle of retaliation. Right? In the Hatfields and the McCoys, you kill a Hatfield, the McCoys are going to respond. You kill a McCoy, the Hatfields are going to respond. But if you want to end the conflict, go pick a third sucker over there and kill him. And then all of a sudden, the third guy becomes the real enemy, and then the Hatfields and the McCoys can get together, right? That is why scapegoating is so productive. And the victim has to be someone so outside, someone so unprotected by the group, that they will not be able to inflict any retaliatory violence on their own part, and whose death can never ultimately lead to an escalation of the conflict. The scapegoat, said Girard, is the mechanism by which a society deflects violence away from itself and focuses on the third-party victim. Hence, said Girard, wherever you see obsessive, irrational, murderous anti-Semitism, there you will find an internally fractured society that if the members stopped killing Jews for a moment, they'd start killing each other. There is hope. The hope and the solution to all of this, in my opinion, and according to Jonathan Sacks, is not bridge building, not education, not understanding each other a little better, though all of that is good. He said the only solution is empathy. And empathy is what in this society we lack more and more every day. In an age of video games where you kill and blow people up without thinking about it, in an age when you see people constantly being butchered on television and you just flip the channel as if it's just another event happening and we cannot respond, empathy is the only way out. How many of you remember that picture of that dazed little boy of Aleppo? Do you remember? We're all watching the disaster going on in Syria, but somehow that little boy sitting in that ambulance chair with the dust all over his face and the blood caked on his body, all of a sudden we started saying, that could be my little boy. And all of a sudden we started talking about things we had never talked before about. We started to empathize with that person. And all of a sudden, it wasn't about barrel bombs, and it wasn't about ISIS, and it wasn't about, Assad. It was about what can we do to end this conflict? So let me take this away from the politics and let me bring it to the Bible for a second. Okay, that's what I know, and I guess that's why I'm here. So the Bible believes in chosenness. Let's be honest, right? And by the way, some Jews are very uncomfortable with the idea of chosenness. God chose me and not you. But yet, when you look at the biblical narrative, every time someone is chosen, the Bible forces you to empathize with the one that is not chosen. Let me give you about 5 examples. Cain kills Abel. Why? Because Abel's sacrifice was accepted. Cain's was not important as to why or what not happens. Cain is exiled. And Cain cries out to God, my punishment is too much to bear. And so God places a mark upon him, and he wanders for the rest of his life. Say what you will about fratricide, but the Bible makes you feel sorry for Cain, the unloved one, the unchosen one. I don't know, strikes me. Abraham and Sarah have 2 children, Isaac and Ishmael. And Sarah, in a fit of jealousy, says to Abraham, get rid of Ishmael. Get rid of Hagar, the stranger. Out. Now I have a son. He's the chosen one. So what happens? Ishmael goes out into the wilderness with his mother Hagar, presumably to die. And there they are sitting out in a place called Ber Lochi Roi. And Hagar says, let me not look upon this child as he dies. And slowly but surely he starts to die from malnutrition and thirst. And according to the text, God opens up her eyes and she sees a well. And he is nourished and he survives. Bible doesn't make you feel for Isaac. Bible doesn't make you feel for Sarah. Bible makes you feel for Ishmael, the unchosen one. By the way, in Muslim tradition, it's Ishmael who is the chosen one, and it's Isaac who is the rejected one. Makes perfect sense, right? Because it's their narrative, not ours. Every time God chooses one of the patriarchs, we're forced to enter into a humanizing relationship with the other. How about Jacob and Esau? My favorite one of all. In the greatest scenes of the Bible, Jacob steals the blessing from his brother through deception, sells it to his brother who's in a moment of weakness, and then in an ultimate act of deception, dresses up like his brother, goes in before the blind father Isaac and says, bless me, Father, before Esau has a chance to come back and offer his gift and receive his blessing. He finally comes in and he realizes that he is out in the cold. Esau is done. It is Jacob now who is the chosen one. And the Jewish people refer to ourselves as Bnei Yaakov, the children of Jacob. I'm sure you hear that in your liturgy as well, right? Jacob is the guy. And you'd think the Bible would say, Jacob, what a great dude he is. But he's the deceiver. It's Esau you feel sorry for. Genesis 27:38. When Esau hears his father's words, he bursts out with a loud and a bitter cry and says, bless me too, Father. Do you not have a blessing for me? Doesn't that move you? It's like the little boy in Aleppo. Even Joseph, the golden child, with the coat of many colors. Brothers hate him. Finally, he becomes the viceroy in Egypt, the number 2 to Pharaoh. This is the earlier Pharaoh, not the Pharaoh I was talking about a few moments ago. And the brothers come down looking for food. And Joseph is going to test them. Joseph's going to see if they're going to do to him. Joseph is going to say, leave your brother Benjamin. I'm going to keep him as my slave, my servant. You go back and get Jacob, the father. And all of a sudden, the brothers realize, my God, we cannot do to our father again what we did to him when we first sold Joseph as a slave. And so one of the brothers stands up and says, no, we cannot do that again. Let me be your slave. Let the boy go free. Having enslaved Joseph, the brothers now have to confront enslavement themselves. They repent. They reveal themselves, and then Joseph gives that famous line, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into slavery. Having tested them to see if they could empathize, then he realizes that they are worthy of his forgiveness, and only then is there reconciliation. Empathy is what the Hebrew Bible is all about. It's dealing with chosenness. It's dealing with the favorite. It's dealing with the house of Israel. But it says, don't forget everybody else. One of my great teachers, I did not know him, but I've read a fair amount of him. His name was Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the greatest rabbis in my generation. He was very involved in the civil rights movement. One day he went down to Memphis and marched with Martin Luther King. And they asked him when the whole thing was over, they said, how did it feel marching with Dr. King? And he said something truly amazing that has sort of echoed in the Jewish community. He said, I felt as if I was praying with my feet. Isn't that powerful? He writes about empathy. It's a little long, I apologize. Empathy, he writes, is the pain a father feels when his child hurts his hand playing ball. The pang a mother knows when her daughter is not invited to the party she had her heart set on. The concern a lover has for the least concern of his or her beloved. the anguish which touches a person when someone bears their troubles to him, the tear a child sheds for the limp of a dog or the broken arm of her doll, the sigh a judge heaves when he must pronounce a strong sentence, the care a doctor exerts towards a patient in pain, the dull tug at the heart of a soldier who sees the destruction he has wrought, the help a business owner extends towards a failing competitor, the forgiveness a person grants towards someone who has hurt him, the pleading of Moses when the people were to be destroyed because of their sin of the golden calf, the weeping of Rachel for the exiles who trudged by her grave on the bloody way to Babylon. It is the eternal mercy of God towards the folly and the misery of humankind. There is a fellow in modern history that I'm 100% sure you've never heard of, but I want to tell you his story because I shared it with my congregation. I share it with you. The fellow's name is Senad Szegedy. Any of you ever heard of him? Not surprised if you haven't. So, Hungary is dealing with a very serious nationalist resurgence. We see this in the Netherlands, we see it in France, sort of nationalism, xenophobia, sort of a hostility towards others. Well, Hungary is light years ahead of France. Jewish community of Hungary is terrified, and many are leaving. Well, there's a fellow who is the head of the Jobbik Party, which is the ultra-nationalist party, and his name was Senad Szegedy. He accused the Jews of all sorts of lies: conspiracy to overthrow the government, controlling the world through the media, being communist sympathizers, international bankers. I don't know how you can be a communist and an international banker at the same time. But you know, if you're an anti-Semite, it doesn't matter. Reason has nothing to do with it. Again, he's picking on the third party, the scapegoat. And he promulgated one of the worst lies ever. It's called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And the Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a false document written by Tsarist leaders to try to single out the Jews for hostility. And it basically is purportedly written by the elders of Zion, the old leaders of Zion, to take over the world economically. It's nonsense. It's a lie, but it will not die. And every time someone's anti-Semitic and they want to sort of attack the Jews, they trudge up this false document. It's about 120 years old. Well, so he's out there spreading the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and his political adversaries in the Jobbik Party decide to do some background on him. And they find out that Senad Szegedy, the ultra-nationalist anti-Semitic leader of the Jobbik Party in Hungary, is in fact Jewish. They discovered that his maternal grandmother was a Jewish survivor of Auschwitz. His maternal grandfather was a survivor of Auschwitz. And that following the war, they survived. They decided, we don't want to survive as Jews anymore, and they converted out and they became Catholic. They were done. By the way, Madeleine Albright's family did the same thing, right? Some of you get to the point where you can't deal with it anymore. Upon hearing this, he denies it. He says, I'm not a Jew. And they bring up the documents and they say, yes, you are. All of a sudden now he realizes he is the guy that he hates. So what does he do? He goes to the local rabbi in Hungary. His name is Rabbi, what's his name? I wrote his name down. Shlomo Kovis. And he says, I'm a Jew. And the rabbi says, you got to be kidding me. He says, I want to come to services. He said, you got to be kidding me. And so he says, come to services. The Jewish community was not as warm and friendly and receptive to him when he came, like I got when I got here. But he realized he had no place else to go, because now he realized he was the personification of all the things he hated. And so he persisted. He went to services. He decides to formally convert to Judaism, attends Shabbat services, learned Hebrew, took on a Hebrew name. He now calls himself David, and he underwent circumcision in 2013, and now he's living as a Jew. No reason you would hear of him, but in my world, it's an important story because he was able to see the other in himself, just like we were able to see ourselves in that little boy. There are 3 times the Torah tells us, the Bible tells us, the Hebrew Bible tells us to love. 1, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. Easy. I can love God. God protects me. God watches over me. That's an abstract. 2nd time it says, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, Jesus said that one, right? A little harder, but my neighbor as myself? Well, maybe my neighbor looks like myself. Maybe that's what it means. I shall love my neighbor who looks like myself. Hard, but easier. You with me? The last time it says, you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. The solution to dualism, which is spreading like a plague in this country, is seeing the stranger as ourselves and doing what we can to love them. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Let me go here. Yeah, please. Why is there so much dualism? I think it's a corruption of religion. I think religion, in its pure form, tries to get people to love the stranger and to welcome the stranger. But if it's corrupted, then it can be used as a force of darkness from the redeemed to the unredeemed. And I think that all religions religion is a beautiful, noble thing, but like all things, it can be corrupted. And I think that one of the major sources to it is religion. I think also nationalism is growing. And I think you see it in Europe, and frankly, we're beginning to see it in this country as well. I think it's all, why? I think it's easy. I think it's simple. I think when I was a little kid, I remember watching, the what do they call them? The spaghetti westerns, right? Remember watching the spaghetti? The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I still love that tune, right? And it was compelling because it was easy, right? Black hat, white hat, good, evil. And as a child, I could understand that very simply. But as I get older, I realize it's not so simple. It's not black hats and white hats. It's not good and evil. We all have a little bit of all of that inside of us. And we're all redeemed and unredeemed at the same time. We all have the angel and the devil in us at the same time. And so that complexity creates cognitive dissonance. I can't deal with it. So I think dualism is compelling because it's easy. And it works if you're looking for sound bites. And I think we live in an age where people are looking for easy answers, and sometimes religious leaders will fuel that, and sometimes our political leaders will fuel that. Please. You want my honest opinion? I'm not a big fan of the book of Job. I'm not a big fan of the book of Job because the book of Job gives an answer that basically we don't know. And God is too big. Who are you to ask God? And for me, I like to I like theology, and I like to wrestle with those topics. And one of my favorite books, it's a very, very easily digestible book, is When Bad Things Happen to Good People, right, by Harold Kushner. That's not a Jobian book, right? Because what he's trying to do is, he's trying to make sense of this. How can you say that God is loving and God is all good and this stuff is happening? And so Job's answer is, well, we don't know. It's in God's hands. We're too feeble to comprehend. And there are lots of religious people, and I don't know what Merrick thinks, but for me, I would never give a sermon on the book of Job because I don't like the answer. I would come up with a theology, and I would try to think of God a little differently. A great theologian by the name of Milton Steinberg within the Jewish community, he was a limited theist, and he argued that God is like our parents who want to fix everything, but in order for free will to exist, has to let us do it ourselves. And sometimes when we make terrible mistakes, we have to live with the consequences. That resonates with me better than the book of Job. Sorry. Please. I'm not even sure I could rephrase the question. But I think if I understand, to take it out of the Holocaust for a moment, I think you're saying there is radical evil in the world. And if there is radical evil in the world and we confront it, is that not dualistic by nature? Would you agree? Am I okay? All right, let me see in my limited way if I can answer that. I think that let's take ISIS, for example. I think we have to have, I'm not a politician, and I don't think, I'm not sure how much influence I have, but if I were in the White House, I would have a dualistic approach. I would have a dual approach, not a dualistic approach. And that is, I would fight and combat evil where I see it, and the terror that I see. But I would not cast the entire wand and say that all Muslims are evil and all Muslims are part of the forces of darkness, and thereby we're going to shun everyone and push everybody away, because just like I do not believe for one moment that all Germans were evil, I believe that Nazism was evil, but I don't believe that all Germans were evil, because there were righteous Germans. Anne Frank, was saved by Miep Geiss. So you cannot lump everybody together. And I think it's easy to say, well, all Muslims, should be banned. But I think that kind of dualistic approach is only going to further push the moderates into radicalization, and will end up in a worse position. So in my opinion, I think George Bush, I'm no huge fan of George Bush, but I think George Bush got it right, when he began this conflict. And he basically said, we're going to fight the radicals and we're going to welcome the moderates, right? Because we want to keep the moderates from becoming radicalized, right? I think the approach that we're seeing now is we're all painting them with the same brush, and that's dualistic, and I think that will blow up in our face. So never again, to me, means fighting evil, but I guess, don't Christians say this? We're going to hate the sin, but love the sinner, right? Isn't that your line? So that is not a dualistic answer, right? The dualistic answer is, I'm going to hate the sin and I'm going to kill the sinner, right? That's what we need to fight. I'm not saying we shouldn't fight injustice. And I'm not saying we shouldn't fight Nazism and ISIS. I do believe that we should. But I don't think we should paint everybody with one brushstroke and say all Muslims are of the forces of darkness. Because, quite frankly, President Obama said it at the National Prayer Breakfast 3 years ago. He said, there are intolerant streams in Christianity and Judaism and in American history. And it's too facile just to simply say it's their problem when it's not our problem, too. Please. Did you all hear the question? If empathy is the answer, how do you teach that? I have a very easy answer for you. My mother. I don't believe empathy can be taught. I think empathy can only be caught. You see it by example. I remember when I was a little boy, I'd walk down the streets of New York City with my mother. And every time we would pass a homeless person, my mother would give that person $1. There was a hot dog guy outside our apartment building, and it was the cold of winter. Makes me want to cry when I tell you this story. And my mom would go outside, and every morning she'd bring him a cup of coffee. Every morning. I think I became empathetic because I saw that. Do you know, I was walking, my kids were little. And we were walking down the streets of Philadelphia, and, you see all these people lying on the subway gratings and all the time. And I was with my kids, and I was with a friend of mine. And I saw this guy, and I was with my kids. And I reached in, and I gave the guy $1. And my friend said, why are you giving him $1? He's a drug addict. You don't know what he's going to do. You should give it to, the Salvation Army. They'll make sure. And I said, I didn't give it for this guy. I want my kids to see me give the $1. Did it only for my kids. That's my answer. If you've got parents who teach that, there's a higher likelihood that your kids will be empathetic. If there's cruelty in the home and indifference in the home, chances are that's what you're going to produce. I'm a rabbi. I don't know. I'm being funny. Justice in the criminal system? Oh, I really, that's above my pay grade. I'm talking about the Bible here. I don't know. Any thoughts on that? I mean, no, I really have. I have nothing to add on that. That's a tough one. Yeah. Go ahead. Well, I have two. One is very rabbinic and one is very modern. There's a phrase by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was a Hasidic master. And he said, Kol ha'ulam kulo gesher tsar ma'od ve'ha'ikar lo lefached. And he said, all of life is like a narrow bridge that we must cross. And the goal is not to be afraid. And that our fear can paralyze us, but ultimately we have to cross the bridge. And so I think what he was saying is that fear can be a great paralyzer. By the way, to go back to Freud for a second, fear can save your life, or it can also destroy your life, right? If you're walking across the street and you see a truck barreling down upon you, you should be afraid, because that fear will make you move out of the way. But if you're in your bed and you feel afraid that you're going to get hit by a truck, that's called a neurosis, right? Right? He said one fear will destroy you and the other fear will save you. I think from a Freudian point of view, we've got to decide what it is we need to be afraid of. And we need to be judicious that we're afraid of the right thing. And I think sometimes we can be afraid of the wrong thing and we're looking in the wrong direction. And I think from a modern perspective, one of the greatest movies I ever saw was by Albert Brooks. The movie was called Defending Your Life. Did any of you ever see that movie? Oh, it was fabulous. It was about a guy who dies, and he goes before God, and God does not ask him, why were you not moral? God asks him, why were you afraid? And why didn't you take enough risks? Why did you live life so cautiously? And I just thought it was just a total turning it around, right? Rather than God saying, well, you did this and this and this, but it was all about fear. And fear immobilizes us. And we end up doing nothing. Or it makes us do the wrong things. So if you have a chance, watch the movie. I thought it was just a brilliant film. It came out maybe 20 years ago, but it still stays with me. My favorite scene in that movie was that he goes into the buffet and he wants to eat something, but there's something with too much cholesterol and too much fat, and he's worried about his weight because he's a bit of a chunky guy, typical Jew, and he's God says, no, it's okay. You can eat whatever you want. There's no consequences. There's no calories. There's no cholesterol. And he said, my God, this is heaven. Yeah. Okay, please. Yes. Thank you for that. Can I amplify that? So Beth Orr, in cooperation with Bethlehem Baptist Church and the Wissahickon Faith Community Association, is screening a movie called 13th, and it's on the 13th Amendment, and which freed the slaves, as you well know. But what it talks about is how the establishment, define it as you will, was terrified of a voting black population. And so what they did was they disenfranchised and suppressed the vote by criminalizing many of the activities associated within the black community. Now, the movie is not saying that blacks are, not guilty of crimes, as all of us are guilty of crimes. But what it does do is it says that the mass incarceration of African Americans, which ultimately was associated with felonization of their crimes, means they can never vote again. And so you have large swaths of black community that would tend to vote more left, unable to vote, and thereby that is influencing the outcome of our political elections. And it talks about how the war on drugs was not just a war on drugs, but it was a war on certain segments of the population in terms to criminalize their behavior. And by the way, Obama was partly involved in decriminalizing some of those activities. But the movie it's very controversial. But I believe strongly that that mass incarceration needs to be looked at very clearly from this country because it has political ramifications, social ramifications, and moral ramifications. So that movie is being shown at Beth Orr, 7 o'clock next Sunday. Is it Oscar nominated? Yeah. Actually, I will tell you I'm rather proud of this. This kind of circles back. My son introduced me to it. So my son was watching it, and he said, Dad, you got to see this film. I watched the film, and I said, and by the way, he's so proud of me, right, because I'm showing this film. He'll be coming and talking about it. So come and you'll meet my son. It's a lovely guy. Yeah. How much time do we have, Merrick? Yeah. Um, so the question is, what happens when we become overwhelmed with it all? That, if we're empathetic, we then become so pained by it, we become immobilized by it. Um, I think the greatest thing we can do when we feel that is to do something, is to get away from the emotion of it, let the emotion spur us, but that ultimately it's what we do that matters, not what we feel. Feeling empathy is just the beginning of it. It's kind of like my freedom thing, right? If empathy is the end, but it doesn't lead to constructive action, then okay, it's nice, but what are you doing about it? So I think that for me, maybe it's male. Like I'm a fixer. Like when people come into my congregation and they say they got this problem, I sometimes have trouble empathizing and going right into, okay, well, this is what you need to do, and da 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 da. And sometimes they'll say to me, well, I don't need you to fix it. I just need you to listen to me. That sounds like my wife sometimes, right? So I think that there has to be a balance between action and empathy. And I think for me, the way I get out of the immobilization is by being mobilized. And that leads me into Marek's point. Beth Orr is kind of getting into some gray areas. We have decided to form we have a social action committee, which houses the homeless and feeds the hungry and does all the things we think are important to do. But we're starting a social justice committee to take our values as Jews and to bring them to the public arena, and to communicate with our congregation and to say this is what we think our position should be on these various different issues, asking for advocacy with our elected officials, asking congregations to write letters, and also empowerment to perhaps do things. It really came from a sense of frustration when congregants called me during the Women's March and said, "What's Beth Orr doing?" And I said, "Nothing. I mean, it's too political." And some of the younger people said, "What do you mean nothing?" And all of a sudden I realized if I'm sitting on the sidelines on this, then the synagogue is going to become irrelevant. And I think if we want to engage young people, I want Beth Orr to be the address where people come to become engaged on some of these important issues. I am well aware that it is a lightning rod and that I'm going to alienate people. I could even lose members over this. Well aware of that. But I also think that we are living in, I'll share my politics, I think we're living in some really terrifying times. And I think that we cannot be the three monkeys, see no evil, do no evil, and say no evil. So I think that we're going to have to do something. And my board is like all over me on this. But I just think that we've got to do something. We've got to do it judiciously. We've got to do it carefully, but we got to do something. So that's an important piece of that empathy piece. I'll keep you posted. I'll let you know if I'm back here next year. It means I survived.
Greg, I'd like to thank you on behalf of our entire congregation. This is one of the best attended forums we've had in 20 years. People adore you. You can speak the truth to us in a loving, very, very intelligent and empathetic way. And I want to put out the challenge that maybe we need to think along the same lines to create a social justice commission here. We do magnificent outreach. It's a trademark that this congregation is so well known for. But this has a little different variation on it, and I do think the times call for it. So if you feel engaged in that topic, please let me know, or let some of the folks in the Outreach Commission know as well. And we'll see what we can do, because I think the more our faith communities can stand together and speak clearly and push back against things that we know are very problematic, our country will stand strong. But if we don't, it could be very, very treacherous. So on that note, we thank you again for joining us. You are a great, great friend to us. Thank you.